Hello and welcome everybody. It's so lovely that you've joined us from all over the world actually for what we hope will be a really interesting take on anti-Semitism, how it changes and how it's been used over the centuries. I would like first of all to introduce myself. My name is Linda Hackner. I'm the Director of Education at the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Centre. And we're really excited to be bringing this lecture to you. Before we begin, or before I begin talking about Ben, I'd like to thank Art Jamming for sponsoring this event. We really appreciate it so much. We're very grateful for their support. And so thank you, Art Jamming, for bringing Ben M. Freeman to us. So Ben, who calls himself Ben M. Freeman, because there are so many Ben Freemans, but I'm just going to refer to him from now on as Ben, is from Glasgow in Scotland and has worked for the Jewish community since he was a very young man. In 2012, he founded an organization called From Yesterday for Tomorrow. And this was a charitable organization that worked with schools to spread awareness of the Holocaust, to combat prejudice. And in its 4 years of operation, From Yesterday for Tomorrow worked with over 5,000 students in Scotland and in the USA. In 2015, Ben moved to Hong Kong to become the Director of Education at the Hong Kong Holocaust Center before moving on to teaching full-time at a progressive international school, all the while lecturing part-time in Holocaust studies at Hong Kong universities. Ben is an activist supporting Jewish people, and as of 2020, he runs webinars educating about anti-Semitism. He works with different companies, supporting them in their inclusion and diversity work, specifically regarding Jews and anti-Semitism. And he speaks publicly about Jewish issues. Prior to lockdown, he has spoken in person to audiences all over the world: UK, USA, Poland, Israel, Kosovo, Qatar, and China, amongst others. His first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, will be released in 2021, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the talk. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Ben to talk about progressive anti-Semitism. Thank you very much, Ben. Over to you.
I want to say quite clearly is this is not in reference to individual non-Jewish people. This is in reference to culture, society, ideologies that make up the non-Jewish world, which really means everywhere but Israel. So again, we're not talking about individual non-Jewish people, we're talking about non-Jewish society. Now, this is a quote tweet from myself. I think it might be the last time I quote myself in this presentation, but please don't hold me to that. And I think this is really important because we are now starting to have conversations about other forms of prejudice that we're not really having about the Jewish experience, even though they apply. So we talk about misogyny, we talk about anti-Black racism being institutional or being systemic, but we never seem to have that conversation regarding anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish racism, as you can also refer to it. So it's important to say that anti-Semitism is institutional. It is systemic. It is deeply embedded in the non-Jewish world. And while we may speak about individual examples, and that includes the Holocaust, we're talking about things, examples that connect to a much larger story, a much larger system of oppression. And Jews were and still are discriminated against by justice systems, political systems, education systems, and religious institutions. And just recently, somebody in France spray painted swastikas over a street, but they were found not to be guilty of anti-Semitism, rather of graffitiing. So that is an example of the justice system being kind of geared against Jewish people. And also let's refer to education systems. In the United States, up until the 1960s, there were quotas on how many Jewish people could attend universities. Those quotas no longer exist. However, with the unbelievable immense abuse that Jewish students receive on campus. And we're talking about from the student body, but also from the universities and the professors. We could say that universities' education or higher education systems are making themselves unsafe for Jewish students. So this still fits into this notion that anti-Semitism is systemic. It is institutional. You know, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we often talk about these individual examples. And, you know, I attended a dinner party with someone who worked for the Cameron Holocaust Commission. So Cameron being David Cameron, and he set up a Holocaust Commission in the UK a few years ago. And she told me that the Nazis created the notion that Jews are obsessed with money. Now, this is obviously totally inaccurate. But it's really important that we understand not just kind of major examples, major manifestations of anti-Semitism. It's really important that we understand their historical roots. Because when we understand their historical roots, they're much easier to spot today. So I have kind of categorized anti-Semitism in 4 different ways: economic libel, blood libel, conspiracy fantasy, and racial libel. Now, I can't take credit for all of these. Economic libel and blood libel, and then originally it was conspiracy libel, were created by Anthony Julius, who was the lawyer who defended Deborah Lipstadt in her trial with David Irving. And through conversations with David Hirsch, who's the great British academic, the expert on left anti-Semitism, I decided to categorize conspiracy libel as conspiracy fantasy. And then racial libel is really my contribution. And this is not something that is spoken about a huge amount anymore, but I believe it should be. So let's kind of discuss and explore these categorizations of anti-Semitism. And one thing I will say is, although I've separated them into 4 different examples, one specific manifestation of anti-Semitism can be all 4. So it's not that, you know, one example has to fit into one of these categorizations. Life is not as neat as that, as we know. So let's look at economic libel. So this is probably the one that most of us are familiar with. Definitely when I'm teaching my classes on the Holocaust, and I begin by asking my non-Jewish students to kind of say different stereotypes of Jewish people, the ones they often come to are the idea that Jewish people are either rich or are very obsessed with money. So that's what this is. It's this notion that we're obsessed with money. And it has 2 kind of main manifestations. The first is the global Jewish financier, so your Rothschild, your Soros, your Jew who's kind of pulling the strings. We also have another manifestation that on the surface seems quite contradictory. And this is your Fagin, Fagin being the character from Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. So you have your poverty-stricken, filthy, perverse, very, very poor Jew. And although on the surface, these 2 may seem to be polar opposites, what we have to be doing is really considering what are these libels or fantasies saying about Jewish people? Because when we do a bit of a deep dive, we see that though on the surface they may be different, they're saying the exact same thing about us. So where did this idea come from? So it is rooted in the accusation that Judas sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. And this really created the narrative that Jewish people will do anything for money, Judas obviously being a Jew. And it was ignored that obviously that Jesus was also a Jew. That was not a convenient part of the narrative. But it was this idea that Jews will betray their friends, they have no morals, they have no ethics. And it was extrapolated on 2,000 or so years later by the Nazis, who said, money is the god of Jews. So we see this is the notion, that Jews are obsessed with money and that's what we worship. So how did this manifest historically? So in the Middle Ages, Jews were funneled into professions that dealt with money. So there's kind of 2 reasons for this. The first being usury, which is the act of lending money with interest, was barred for Christians by the church. Although ironically, the passage that was the inspiration behind this specific law came from Leviticus, which is obviously the Torah, the Old Testament. So actually initially referred to Israelites, to Jewish people. But the Christians at that time saw themselves as the new Israelites, so they took this to refer to themselves. We also, at the same time, had Jews being banned from doing a lot of professions. So they couldn't own land. So they were funneled into financial services. And there was also a high level of literacy and numeracy in the Jewish community. The Jewish emphasis on learning and on education obviously is seen even then. And this created Jews as the face of financial services. even though it didn't actually reflect the reality, because Jews were not the group that dominated this field. Even though Christians were barred, they were still the majority of moneylenders, tax collectors, rent collectors, but Jewish people became the face. And this was incredibly precarious. And this is something we will see later on in this section. Jews being associated with money and wealth is very dangerous for Jewish people. So at this time, you saw Jewish people, communities literally being sold between different lords, different kings. You had Jewish people being seen as literal property, and you had Jewish people being stolen from, Jewish people being expelled. The 1290 expulsion of the Jews from England really was rooted in this idea of economic libel and the fact that the king said to the lords, okay, I will raise taxes, but I will free you of your debt by expelling the Jews. So this later evolved into the court Jew, and these were Jews who ran the finances of European lords and kings, and they were a direct continuation of this. Now, these Jews could become wealthy, they could become powerful in some situations, but again, they were still Jews living in a highly, deeply anti-Semitic world. And these Jews, like the Jews we just spoke about, were stolen from. They were executed if the lord or king who sponsored them died. A very famous example of that is Joseph Seuss Oppenheimer, who the Nazis made a film about. He was executed when the Duke of Württemberg died. And just before his execution, he was asked to convert to Christianity, which he refused to do. So how does this manifest? So this really manifests in economic conspiracies. So Rothschild, more recently Soros, but also in this accusation that the Jews financed the slave trade. So this is a lie. This is not true. So this is an absolute example of economic libel, and as we will see, also conspiracy fantasy. It was spread by Louis Farrakhan in his 1991 book, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews. And what he sought to do is blame Jewish people, using this narrative about Jewish people and money for the slave trade. Now, experts and scholars on the slave trade have said this is categorically untrue. Were Jewish people involved? Absolutely, yes. People from many, many different groups were involved, and we don't excuse their actions. But this notion that their actions are kind of magnified as to represent the role of the entire Jewish people is deeply anti-Semitic. So accusations of Jews being obsessed with money, Jews being wealthy, Jews being greedy. I remember when I was 13, and my mother is on this call. She's called in from Scotland, and I don't think I ever told her this, but I was walking down the street with one of my friends when I was 13, and he said to me, "Can I borrow money?" And I said, "I don't have any money." And he said, "But you're Jewish." And that just shows how deeply embedded these ideas are. That boy, that child, was not anti-Semitic. He had just absorbed this notion that Jewish people are obsessed with money from the world around him, because it is deeply embedded. As we said earlier, it is institutional, it is systemic. It also has more dire manifestations or more dire results. And people often think, oh, so what's so bad about saying Jews are wealthy? And one of the reasons it's so bad is that it results in the murder of Jewish people. So pictured here is Ilan Halimi. He was a Moroccan French Jew, and in 2006 he was kidnapped by a gang who referred to themselves as the Gang of Barbarians. They scouted Ilan, and they chose him specifically because his family were Jewish, and they believed because they were Jewish they would be able to get a large ransom. So a ransom of 450,000 euros was demanded, which is obviously a huge amount of money. The family were immigrants, they could not afford it. And when they told the kidnappers, we can't afford it, they were told, go ask the synagogue. Anyway, no money came. And over the course of 3 weeks, Ilan was tortured beyond belief, beyond physical recognition. And after 3 weeks, his body was dumped at the side of a road, and he died en route to hospital. So Ilan's kidnapping, his torture, and his murder was a direct manifestation, a direct result of this notion that Jewish people are wealthy. And again, we have to look deeper. So what is this really saying? It isn't just saying that Jewish people are wealthy. It isn't just saying that Jewish people love money. No, it's saying we don't have morals. We don't have ethics. All we care about is money. We don't care about other people. We don't care about human relationships. All we care about is money, and we're willing to do anything and everything to get money. So that's really framing us as a very sinister, dark, evil people. So again, we always have to look slightly deeper. So the next manifestation is blood libel. Now, I think that blood libel is probably one of the most difficult forms, categorizations of anti-Semitism to spot today, because it has changed somewhat in its manifestation. However, the roots are still there. So historically, it's the accusation that Jews murder non-Jewish children, usually during Pesach, Passover, to use their blood. Now, something we'll notice about anti-Semitism, just like the two very polar opposite representations of economic libel, Soros and Fagin, is that rationale or logic is never a part of this. This is not rational, it is not logical. Because if it was rooted in rationale, those who studied the Jewish people would know that we were actually banned from using blood, engaging with blood, ingesting blood. So we can quite categorically point to Leviticus and say, actually, this could never be true. But this was never really about truth. It was about an emotional hatred. So historical roots of this lie in ancient Greek writings. So people like Apion, who said, he was a Greco-Roman writer, who said there were Jews in the temple and they were consuming the flesh of Greeks. So again, we have to look deeper. This isn't just saying, okay, Jewish people are killing children or Jewish people are killing Greeks in the temple. No, it's saying that Jewish people are barbarians, we're perverse, we are almost super evil. And that is connected to economic libel. They may look quite different on the surface, but actually they're really saying the same thing about us. So blood libel took on a deeper significance with the Christian accusation that Jews killed Jesus. So in my classes, I always say to my students, who killed Jesus? And they always come back with the answer, the Romans, which is correct. The Romans killed Jesus. They executed him. However, in 380 CE, Rome converted to Christianity. So in 380 CE, Rome was faced with a very uncomfortable truth. And that truth was the fact that about 350 years earlier, they had murdered their Lord, their God, their Savior. So they needed a new scapegoat. But they didn't just pick out a hat. They chose the Jewish people because they themselves had had interactions with Jewish people. Remember, they were the ones controlling the Jewish states in the Levant, in the Middle East, obviously they being responsible for the death of Jesus. But they also looked to the writings of the disciples of Jesus and the early Christians, who many of them said the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus. Now we need to take this writing with an enormous pinch of salt, because these men were originally Jews. Jesus was a Jew, he lived as a Jew, and he died as a Jew. And his followers were originally Jews. So the fact that they have written this kind of demonstrates that they're grappling with their own Jewish identities, which is something that we will touch on briefly later. So with the accusation that the Jews killed Jesus, Jesus being God, Jesus being the Son of God, Jesus being pure and holy and good, this really meant then that the Jews could kill anyone and anything, including children. So how has this manifested throughout history? So there have been constant accusations, hundreds and hundreds of accusations, that Jews have kidnapped primarily non-Jewish children to use their blood. The first in Europe was in 1144 with William of Norwich. And then there was many cases in Spain, in Portugal. There was another few cases in England. And I want to point to number 2, the Damascus blood libel. So Damascus being the capital of Syria. Now, this is really important because when we talk about anti-Semitism, we talk often primarily about the Holocaust. And if we go slightly further, we often talk about Europe. We talk about pogroms, we talk about expulsions, we talk about the stories of Ashkenazi Jews. But the reality is, as I said in my first slide, there are 3 other major sub-ethnic groups, Mizrahi, Sephardic, and Bet Israeli, all of whom were experiencing versions of what the Ashkenazi Jews were experiencing, because there really is a shared Jewish experience in positive ways, but also in more negative ways regarding anti-Semitism. So it's really important that we discuss an example like the Damascus blood libel, which impacted Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in Syria. So this took place in 1840, and it was the accusation that an Italian priest, a friar, and his Muslim manservant were kidnapped. And a Jew was arrested, and this Jew, under duress, under coercion, torture, he confessed. More Jews were arrested, the synagogue was looted and ransacked, and 60 plus Jewish children were kidnapped so that their mothers would give up the information about the whereabouts of these two men. And this spread around the world, and the reporting in the countries is really kind of shocking. In the Times newspaper in Britain, somebody wrote an opinion piece based on the Damascus blood libel at the time that said, we have to rid the Jewish religion from the face of the earth. So we could see that, things that we experience today, things that were said about Jews during the Shoah, have been said about Jewish people for many, many years. We're going to just go back to Europe, to Kiev with the next example. And Andrei Yushchynsky was kidnapped in 1913. And a Jew, Menachem Mendobelis, was imprisoned and laterally trialed. But I said at the beginning of this section that this is sometimes the hardest to spot today because of how it manifests. So as I said, we have to be looking at what it's really saying. Not just that we're kidnapping kids, not just that we're kidnapping Italian priests, no. It's saying that Jewish people are perverse. Jewish people are evil. Jewish people are actually the center of evil, unnatural. And that means that anything seen as evil can be blamed on the Jews. So there is a modern accusation that Israel purposely kills Palestinian children to steal their organs. Now, this may seem on the surface to be a criticism of policy. However, when we look into it, we say, no, what they're doing is saying the same thing they've said about Jewish people for 1,000 years, that they are super evil, because this is not a normal accusation. This is not a normal thing for a country to do. This is not even saying that Palestinian children were killed and were collateral damage and that's terrible. No. It's saying there's a conspiracy at the highest level of the Israeli government, the Jewish state, to murder Palestinian children to steal their organs. So once again, Jews murdering non-Jewish children for their flesh. Now, a more recent example is the accusation that Israel trained the US police that killed George Floyd and other Black Americans who have been murdered due to police brutality and systemic racism in the United States. And what this is doing is blaming Israel for the ills of anti-Black racism in the United States. It inadvertently, cleanses America of responsibility and says, as we saw the Romans do in 380 CE, it's the Jews' fault. And this is being spread around the world, and it was spread around the world this summer. So Jews were accused, or rather Israel as the collective Jew was accused this summer of training police that killed George Floyd. And again, this is not true. So, conspiracy fantasy, the one that was originally conspiracy libel. And the reason I changed it is because this is pure fantasy. All of it is pure fantasy. And I mentioned at the beginning, anti-Semitism is based on the non-Jewish world's perceptions of the Jews. It is not based on our reality. In fact, it erases our reality. So that's why I decided to refer to this as conspiracy fantasy. So modern conspiracy fantasy is a development of economic libel, although importantly, we have to note that accusations of conspiracy have been made against Jews historically. So if we refer back to blood libel, the blood libel were also conspiracies because they were the notion that Jewish communities were getting together, conspiring together to murder a non-Jewish child. The accusation that Jews poisoned the wells during the Black Plague were also conspiracy. Accusations today that we will get to, that Jewish people were responsible for COVID-19, are accusations of conspiracy. So as I said, modern examples are really rooted in this notion of economic libel, that the Jews are controlling the world to gain resources for financial gain. So as I just said, it's the Jews seek to control the world and or world events for their own benefit. And this really became solidified in a modern sense with the publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1903. So this was a total fantasy, a total forgery, never happened, but it was printed in newspapers in the Russian Empire. And it framed itself as being the minutes of 24 meetings that Jewish elders held in a Prague graveyard, although sometimes it's a Basel graveyard. So these Jews were getting together and they were basically talking about how to control the world. And every single major world event, including the French Revolution, was explained with, will the Jews done it? And this is something we have to consider about conspiracy fantasy and really all conspiracy theories. They are seeking to explain the world. People seek fantasy, they seek the libels because they want to understand the world. They want to understand something they do not understand. And they have decided through anti-Semitism that they explain these world events through the Jews. So The protocols, as I said, was proven to be a forgery, but it was spread everywhere. It was spread in the United States by Henry Ford of Ford and Motor fame, and 500,000 copies were distributed. It was spread in the United Kingdom, and again, journalists who wrote for the Time newspapers wrote the foreword, the translation. It was spread in the Middle East by the Nazis, of course. They loved it. They printed 23 copies between 1933 and 1939, and it was spread by the Soviet Union. And that's the thing about anti-Semitism that we have to understand, is because it's irrational, and because it serves a specific purpose that we'll get to in a moment, it can be used by people who on the surface seem to be enemies. So you have the Nazis and the Soviets, seemingly very nothing in common, fought each other during World War II, both drawing on the same material for their anti-Semitism. How does it manifest today? So it manifested in the notion that the Jews were smearing Jeremy Corbyn. So as you know, as Linda said, I'm from Glasgow, Scotland, which is in the United Kingdom, and British Jews have just been experiencing, or we're at the end of it now, but for about 5 years or 4 years, we experienced Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of Her Majesty's most loyal opposition, the Labour Party. Now, he was an anti-Semite, and when Jewish people accused him of being an anti-Semite, or rather called out his quite obvious anti-Semitism, they were accused of smearing him. And his opponents sometimes didn't even need to refer to the Jews. They just said, there is a smear campaign. Jeremy's political opponents are smearing him. And even when they weren't referring to Jewish people, we can understand that this is still rooted in this notion of Jewish power, of Jewish conspiracy. I myself was accused regularly on Twitter of being paid by the Israeli government to smear Corbyn. So number two, Israel was accused of perpetrating 9/11. Oh, sorry. Israel was, Linda, I think your mic is now on. Oh. Okay, so Israel was accused of perpetrating 9/11. Israel is accused of controlling the media, the wars, government. Polls have been done time and time again, and shockingly, huge numbers of people say that the Jews do control the wars, the Jews do control the government. Again, we see the accusation that Israel purposely kills Palestinian children to steal their organs. And as I said at the beginning, many things can be both blood libel, conspiracy fantasy, economic libel. As I mentioned, the Jews were accused of spreading COVID-19. And if we look at this image, this was an image put about by the far right. And it's saying the Jews are responsible for COVID, just as they said we were responsible for the Black Plague. The Jews were also accused of being behind the Black Lives Matter protests. And again, this is where we see contradiction, irrationale, because just before we saw Israel being accused of training the police that murdered George Floyd. But here we see George Soros, who is a very wealthy Jew. He's a billionaire, and he is often at the root of, or the center of modern conspiracy fantasy accusations. And he is accused of being behind the Black Lives Matter protests. So on one hand, you have a Jew being behind the protests, but on another hand, you have Jews being behind the crimes that started the protests. It's obviously total fantasy. So racial libel. So this is not something we really talk about anymore. And I think that's a mistake, and I think we should speak about it. It has two main manifestations. One is judgments on the idea of Jewish ancestry and the physical appearance of Jews. So let's look at this notion of Jewish shared ancestry. So we have to be very clear. There is such a thing as Jewish shared ancestry. We can trace Jewish genetics, for example. That is not to say that these genetics are, or this idea of shared ancestry is the be-all and end-all of Jewishness. It's absolutely not. However, we must recognize that it exists, and we cannot pretend that it doesn't exist because it has been used against us. Because what the Nazis said, what we will see they said in Spain, has no bearing in our reality. It was, again, non-Jewish fantasy. So we saw Sephardic Jews in Spain being accused of having dirty blood. So the old Christians were accused of having clean blood. And the Jews in Spain and Portugal, even though they converted, even though they were forced, as we know, during the Inquisition, the period of the Inquisition, to convert to Christianity, we know that, but even after they converted, they were still murdered. So the 1506 Lisbon massacre was against Jews who had converted. because at that time there was no one living openly as a Jew in Portugal. So Jews being targeted for their Jewish blood, inverted commas. So we could say that this anti-Semitism, the Sephardic Jews of Spain's story, is racial as well as being religious, because it's about their bodies, their biology, their identity. And even though that's the case, it has absolutely no bearing or anything about the realities of Jewish shared ancestry. And we must be very clear about that. It became solidified as a scientific theory with pseudoscience in the 19th century and was obviously used by the Nazis. And this really became the root of their anti-Semitism. And in 1935, they passed the Nuremberg laws, which really legislated, legalized this form of racial anti-Semitism. Now, it kind of went out of fashion, to be quite honest, after the Holocaust, but it still exists today. Some of you may have heard of the Khazar theory. So the Khazar theory is this idea that Ashkenazi Jews are not indigenous to the state of Israel, but rather we're descendants of the Khazar tribe, who were a tribe kind of in the Mediterranean in Turkey. So to say quite clearly that we're not indigenous to that land, and we're converts. And that is a judgment on this concept of Jewish ancestry, because it's a judgment on Jewish blood and saying where Jewish people came from. Now let's turn our attention to this notion of Jews being shamed, being demonized for their physical appearance. So this idea really first emerged in the 13th century. And before this, Jewish people were depicted wearing hats, they had their big beards if they were men, or they were wearing a special symbol, because as we know, the Nazis did not invent the idea of Jews wearing a symbol which marked them as Jews. So in the 13th century, there was a push towards, they called realism, and they began to draw Jews, with big noses. And this became the kind of representation. In Spain, in, I believe, the 15th century, there was a poet who wrote a poem about his enemy, someone he accused of being a conversos, so a Jew who converted to Christianity. And the poem is literally 14 lines about how big his nose is. And it frames Jewish physical features as representative of our perceived worst character traits. Because let's be honest, anti-Semites don't draw Jews that look like Barbra Streisand, beautiful women who might not necessarily fit into Eurocentric beauty standards. No, they draw Jews that look like this image or any of the other images we've seen in this presentation. So it is an exaggeration, it is a demonization, and it harms Jewish people and it shames Jewish people. Although it is less common now, traditionally they said that nose jobs were a rite of passage for young Jewish people. Now that's terrible. And what those young people were dealing with is A, not fitting Eurocentric beauty standards, because we remember Jewish people have shared ancestry and they are indigenous to Levant, to the Middle East, so they may not fit Eurocentric beauty standards, but also they are dealing with 1,000 years worth of anti-Semitic shame. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the TV show Glee, but I rewatched it recently during COVID, and it's a musical theatre show, and there is a Jewish character. And almost every episode, there is a joke about her nose. And there is an entire episode actually about her getting a nose job. And this shames Jewish people, and we must guard against this. And I have a book coming out in the beginning of next year called Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. And it discusses this idea of reclaiming Jewish beauty and rejecting the shame of anti-Semitism. And it's one of the reasons we must discuss racial libel, because we have to understand why Jewish people feel the way they do and how the non-Jewish world and their perceptions of us impact our own identities. So those are the 4 categorizations of anti-Semitism. And they all say the same thing, even though they may look quite different. So what are they saying? They're saying that Jewish people are perverse, unnatural, super evil, immoral, lacking in ethics. And this is very complicated for when we consider perceptions of prejudice today, particularly in the progressive world. So there is a view that racism states it as prejudice plus power, which really is saying only those with power over others can be racist. Now that was in reference to anti-Black racism in the United States, obviously, but it has kind of spilled out to kind of be the general definition of prejudice. It has to involve power. So it's marginalized groups, oppressed groups with less or no power. However, anti-Semitism, through blood libel, through economic libel and conspiracy fantasy, frames Jews as powerful. It frames Jewish people as wealthy and as privileged. And therefore, many, many people, including those in the progressive world on the left, have great difficulty in understanding anti-Semitism and recognizing it as a legitimate form of prejudice. And this was something said about Jeremy Corbyn, that he just could not understand this notion that you could be racist towards Jewish people, because he said, well, Jewish people are privileged, they're powerful, they're wealthy. But we know that anti-Semitism has targeted Jews, genocidal anti-Semitism has targeted Jews, regardless of their wealth, for 1,000 years. And anti-Semitism in general has targeted Jews for 2,000 years. But still, it is not seen as a legitimate form of prejudice. And there's a quote from an American activist who is the former co-chair of the Women's March. Her name is Linda Sarsour. She said, I want to make the distinction that while anti-Semitism is something that impacts Jewish Americans, it's different than anti-Black racism or Islamophobia because it's not systemic. Essentially, she's saying it's not as bad. And we know that is not the case. No form of prejudice is worse than others. Prejudice is prejudice, and all prejudices must be combated and must be fought against. And this notion that anti-Semitism is not as bad as other forms of prejudice is ludicrous, particularly when you understand the Jewish experience. But as I continuously have said, anti-Semitism erases our experience, it erases our reality. Now, I do these classes with my students and we cover the same material, and then they always have a question for me. Why has anti-Semitism persisted? They are living in Hong Kong. They see themselves as very different to the Romans, to the Nazis, of course, and they can't understand why anti-Semitism is still such an issue today and why we have not solved it. Now, this leads us rather to something called the cloud of anti-Semitism. Now, this is something I created. This is an image that will appear in my book, and it seeks to explain in a very simple way why anti-Semitism has not been solved, or why it has persisted, let's say. So constantly you have the cloud of anti-Semitism drizzling down rain on people. Now, some people it stays on the surface of their skin and they may kind of just say anti-Semitic things, but they're not necessarily deeply anti-Semitic. They won't necessarily hate Jews. They will just be repeating stereotypes. Like the boy, like my friend who asked me when I was 13 years old if he could borrow money. He did not hate Jews. He just absorbed the prejudice that existed around him. Some people have umbrellas, as you can see, and that is through education. You develop an umbrella through critical thinking, and that protects you from these rains. Other people, of course, for some reason, the rains seep deep into them. They get soaking wet, and they're the people who really hate Jews. Now, it can rain at different levels, at different spaces and times, and sometimes it starts to rain harder and harder, and people only notice when they're soaking wet, and then it is too late. But what we must do is we must spread umbrellas. So we can see here in the first image, we have a man sheltering a person, and he is passing on knowledge, passing on critical thinking. And then in the last image, we see 3 people have their own umbrellas. And that's one of the ways we combat anti-Semitism. It's one of the ways we combat all forms of prejudice, is by spreading umbrellas and helping other people open their umbrellas. And that really is rooted in education, critical thinking, and dialogue. Now, a more academic perspective on why anti-Semitism has persisted comes from David Nierenberg. So I'm a huge fan of David Nierenberg. I think his work is brilliant, particularly Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And I, in fact, have based the second chapter of my book off his theory. So he says, anti-Judaism should not be understood as some archaic or irrational closet in the vast edifices of Western thought. It was rather one of the basic tools that edifice was constructed. And what he's saying is that anti-Semitism is one of the building blocks of Western and other civilizations. It is deeply, deeply embedded. And essentially it manifests in the idea that the non-Jewish world uses their idea, remember again, their idea of Jews to define itself and to make sense of the world. So let's look at the early Christians. So we have the early Christians who at one point were Jews, as we know, defining themselves as Christian against Jews. So if the Jews were material, Christians were spiritual. If the Jews were earthly, Christians were heavenly. If the Jews were to circumcise, the Christians were not to circumcise. And this was a real parting of the ways, but it was a creation, a formation of Christian identity in specific opposition to Jewish identity and to Judaism. And this developed into this notion of adversos Judaeos, which literally means against the Jews. And this was preached by early Christian preachers who accused people of being Jews, who accused Christians of Judaizing. And again, it was this notion that Christianity was defining itself against the Jews. Again, with this notion of making sense of the world, if we look to Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, he created a metaphor called the blind man in the mirror. And he said that Jewish people serve a purpose. And our purpose is to be the blind men in the mirror. What are we blind to? We're blind to the path of Jesus. So why can't we just be murdered? Because he said quite specifically, slay them not. So he said very clearly, we have to have them around. Why? Because we were to exist as a fossil of antiquity. So the Christians could see what happens when you don't follow Jesus. So again, the Christians are using us to make sense of the world and to define identity. This became so embedded in the culture, in the building blocks of Western and other civilization, that even when the power of the church had subsided, these ideas remained. And this is where we can talk about, say, cultural Christianity of Europe or America. We see it with writings of Karl Marx, and we see it today regarding anti-Zionism. So anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism which targets or focuses on the state of Israel. And what we're seeing today is this phenomenon of young people who are not necessarily even young people, but people who identify as progressive or left-wing, defining themselves as progressive and left-wing through anti-Zionism. So they're saying, I'm anti-racist because I'm anti-Zionist. I'm progressive because I am anti-Zionist. We're also seeing it warp slightly. Now, as we saw with this 4 categorizations of anti-Semitism, we have seen that anti-Semitism is always shifting and warping and always fits the zeitgeist. Now, as Linda said, I live in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has recently been rocked by the Hong Kong protests. But during the protests, I noticed that a specific phrase was emerging. This phrase was Chinazi, which is a portmanteau of China and Nazi. And this was the protesters using their idea of Jewish victimhood from the Holocaust to define their victimhood as the protesters. So let's just be clear, what are they saying? They were saying the Chinese are the Nazis, and by definition, that makes them the Jews. So we are continuing to see the non-Jewish world use its own ideas of Jews to define their own identities. So usually, historically, it was to define what they are not. Now it is to define what they are as victims. So this is an image from an anti-racist march, which says, you're not anti-racist if you're not anti-Zionist. And this is from the Hong Kong protests. Dear world, end China-Nazi, please. And this is really a call to arms. This is the the Hong Kong protesters saying, world, you have to come and help us. The China-Nazis are coming to get us. So they're using this notion of Jewish victimhood to appeal to the world, even though the world stood by and allowed the Holocaust to happen and allowed 6 million Jews to be murdered. Now, we have Karl Marx, who I mentioned first in that list. And in 1843, he wrote on the Jewish question. And he said, the Jew has emancipated himself in a Jewish manner, not only because he has acquired financial power, but also because through him, and also apart from him, money has become a world power, and the practical Jewish spirit has become the practical spirit of the Christian nations. The Jews have emancipated themselves insofar as the Christians have become Jews. So what Karl Marx was saying, it is my opinion, there's other people who disagree with this and say he was kind of going and attacking someone else. But it is my perspective, what he is saying is that if a Christian becomes capitalist, then they become Jews. Why? Because Jews represent capitalism. And again, this is rooted not only in what David Nierenberg said, but in economic libel. So this brings us very nicely on to left-wing anti-Semitism. And as I said about Jeremy Corbyn, because of economic libel and conspiracy fantasy, the left often sees Jews as privileged and powerful. And we can see from Marx's quote that anti-Semitism played a foundational role in the creation of Marxist socialism. So there were people in Britain who were saying, I can't believe that Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitic. And it's like, well, actually, it's not that surprising when you consider the history of anti-Semitism on the left. That's not to say, of course, that you have to be, if you're on the left, you have to be anti-Semitic. That is, of course, not the case, but it is prevalent. And this was kind of expanded upon by Ulrich Marie Meinhof, who was a co-founder of the Red Army faction in Germany from the 1970s. And she said, Auschwitz meant that 6 million Jews were killed and thrown on the waste heap of Europe for what they were considered money Jews. Finance, capital, and the banks, the hardcore of the system of imperialism and capitalism, had turned the hatred of men against money and exploitation and against the Jews. Anti-Semitism is really a hatred of capitalism. So we're seeing this notion, before we even start talking about anti-Zionism, which is a modern leftist form of anti-Semitism, we're seeing that this notion that Jews are capitalist, Jews are wealthy, Jews are powerful, being embedded in the left. So, anti-Zionism. So before we start talking about anti-Zionism, we have to talk about Zionism very briefly. Zionism is the movement of self-determination to return the Jewish people to their indigenous homeland. The Jews, as a people, are indigenous to the Levant, indigenous to the Middle East. They had independent states of Judah and Israel, and they were expelled. And then for the following 2,000 years, they experienced multiple genocides. So Zionism, as it came to be the political movement, was formed in the 19th century to return the Jewish people to their indigenous homeland. Anti-Zionism says quite differently, though. Anti-Zionism was a post-Holocaust form of anti-Semitism created by the Soviet Union. And many people who describe themselves as anti-Zionist are not aware of this. And it was a part of the Soviet policy, even from the beginning of it, the USSR, but it really intensified following the creation of the State of Israel, and particularly following Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. And the Soviet Union produced propaganda. They led campaigns that demonized, delegitimized, and treated Israel with double standards through propaganda. And it resulted in the 1975 United Nations General Assembly resolution that Zionism was racism. So this is where it came from. It is a Soviet form of propaganda. And along with deep-seated anti-Semitism in Russia, because we have to remember, many of the worst crimes committed against Jews in the last few hundred years were committed in the Russian Empire. So that cultural anti-Semitism that existed, along with this concept that the Russians wanted, the Soviets rather, wanted to stamp out nationalist movements, led them to really go after Zionism. But they went after Zionism much more than they went after the other national movements from in the Soviet Union, because they viewed the Jews as a nation. So we can say that this is a factor, but primarily the reasons for Russian anti-Semitism, the Soviet anti-Semitism lies in Russian anti-Zionism lies in anti-Semitism. And why didn't they just call it anti-Semitism? Because as I said earlier, they drew from the same sources as the Nazis. Well, that answer lies in the Holocaust. Though the non-Jewish world is anti-Semitic, that is still a leap to agreeing or to participating in the murder of millions of Jewish people. So the world was shocked, and anti-Semitism was associated with the Nazis. And the Russians who had fought against the Nazis, who had liberated all of the 6 death camps in Poland, did not want to be associated with that kind of terrible form of hatred, so associated with their former enemies. So they created anti-Zionism. So they framed Israel as a center of colonialism and imperialism, something we still see today, and they said it was connected to Nazism. They said it was the worst country in the world, and that had nothing to do with policy. It was about the concept of a Jewish state. So yet again, we're seeing the same thing said about Israel that was said about Jewish people as individuals or as a collective for thousands of years. Evil, the source of all evil, perverse, unnatural, barbaric. So Israel is targeted as the collective Jew. This is a banner, an advert rather, from the Pravda Vostoka from December 1971. And it is the banner of the Zionist gang. And obviously we see in the middle a Star of David, a Magen David, in the shape or connected to a swastika. But if we actually just look down the page just ever so slightly, we see the faces or the profiles of the people carrying the banner. Now, they look mighty similar to the racial libel images that we saw earlier in the presentation. So although the Soviets said, no, this is not anti-Semitism, it's anti-Zionism, we're against a country, we can see that what they were doing was targeting Jews, albeit through a different name. So through the Soviet Union and through a global campaign, the global left began to identify anti-Zionism as a leftist position. And this is a quote from Philip Spencer, the historian, in 2018 regarding Jeremy Corbyn. What began as a Stalinist cry was taken up in some of the New Left, which helped shape the worldview of Jeremy Corbyn and many of his supporters. Now, one thing I would disagree with Mr. Spencer is it was not some of the New Left, it was the vast majority of the New Left. However, It is possible to criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. So obviously we've just talked about anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel. Let's be very clear about that. It is a form of anti-Semitism. There's also this notion that Jewish people themselves, ourselves, have put about that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic either. Now, there's actually more nuance to that. Criticism of Israel can be anti-Semitic, however, not inherently. So how can we see whether something is anti-Semitic or rather it's just fair criticism of Israel? And we can look to Natan Sharansky's 3D test. Natan Sharansky, incidentally, was a Soviet Jew. So does the statement demonize Israel? Does it delegitimize Israel? Does it treat Israel with double standards? If the answer is yes, then that statement can be described as anti-Semitic. So let's break it down. Demonize Israel, framing Israel as the worst country in the world. Delegitimize Israel, stating that Israel does not have a right to exist. Treating Israel with double standards, ignoring similar or worse situations taking place in other parts of the world, or indeed in other parts of the Middle East, but only focusing on Israel. So this brings us to progressive anti-Semitism. So there is this notion on the left that it is the moral side of the argument. And therefore, because these people are moral, they're immune to anti-Semitism. And that is not the case. It is absolutely not the case. There's also this myth that only the hard left are anti-Semitic. And that's also not the case either. Those who we would consider to be soft left or progressive are also prone to anti-Semitism. So some examples of progressive anti-Semitism specifically. So the Dyke March is a very famous example, and Dyke used to be a slur for lesbians, and it has been reclaimed by gay and lesbian women. And this is a march for lesbians and bisexual women, queer women, to kind of celebrate their identities. And Jewish queer women were told at these marches more than once that they must not display symbols of Jewishness. So they must not show a Star of David. Now, I'm a gay Jew, and I every day wear a black kippah with a rainbow Star of David. And it is my right as a Jew to represent my dual identities in any way that I see fit, just as it is the right of these queer women to celebrate their queerness and their Jewishness. And this is what the progressive world is doing. They're forcing Jews to choose. Either you're a progressive or you're a Jew. Now, this is a terrible, devastating, unfair choice to force people to make. We see the accusation of pinkwashing. Pinkwashing is the accusation that Israel purposely elevates its record of LGBTQ plus rights to diminish what it's doing to the Palestinians. Now, this is an attack on nuance, because as we know, multiple truths can exist at once. Israel is locked in a long-running conflict with the Palestinians, that is true. And Israel is also the most progressive place in the Middle East, potentially in the whole of Asia, for LGBTQ rights. And both truths can exist at the same time. But what the progressive world does, particularly the LGBTQ plus progressive world, is say, no, it cannot be just that Israel is, more positive, strong on LGBTQ rights. No, they are purposely manipulating everyone to diminish what they're doing to the Palestinians. So again, examples of conspiracy fantasy. The Women's March. So I referenced Linda Sarsour earlier. Now, Linda Sarsour was the former co-chair, and the Women's March again were praising anti-Semites such as Louis Farrakhan, and they told Jewish women that they were not allowed to display Jewish symbols, and they were creating a very hostile environment to openly Jewish women. Now, this is terrible, because when you are fighting for your rights as a lesbian, as a gay man, as an LGBTQ plus person, or just as a heterosexual woman, you want to stand in solidarity with people like you. That doesn't mean just Jews, lesbians, LGBTQ plus people, women. However, the progressive world is forcing LGBTQ, or rather progressive Jews, not just LGBTQ, it's forcing progressive Jews to choose. Either you're progressive or you're Jewish. And we know you can be both. You can be progressive and you can be Jewish. And social justice is a major part of Jewish tradition. And that is often either ignored or is manipulated to say that the entire point of the Jewish people is to exist solely to help other people, whereas we know that is not the case. We also saw it this summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, That is not to say that the entirety of the Black Lives Matter protests are anti-Semitic, of course not, but there were some from those quarters who are. The British official Black Lives Matter Twitter account tweeted Free Palestine. Now, we know that on paper, Free Palestine may seem fairly innocuous and may not seem itself anti-Semitic. However, the context behind that phrase is often deeply anti-Semitic. But why? Why are we seeing anti-Semitism from some Black civil rights campaigners? Because we understand that anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism are both ideologies promoted by white supremacy. So both Black people and Jews are hated by white supremacists. So we should be standing together side by side against our common threat. But here we see an example of absolutely anti-Black racism in the Jewish community, but also a movement to support, promote Black civil rights, espousing anti-Semitic ideology. And again, to clarify, that is not every single person involved in the Black Lives Matter protest, rather it is the official organizations themselves. But why has this happened? So, anti-Zionism, pro-Palestinianism, and Black civil rights. So, Soviet anti-Zionism, along with perceptions of Jewish power, again rooted in economic libel, blood libel, conspiracy fantasy, saw certain Black civil rights campaigners such as Angela Davis align themselves with the Soviet Union and thus the Palestinians. And this was not a one-off partnership. In 1971, the CIA estimated that 5% of the Soviet propaganda budget was devoted to promoting Davis. This was a long-term ideological partnership. It was also not a position of all civil rights campaigners. For example, we know that Martin Luther King was a Zionist. However, this embedded the notion of US racial politics, the US racial binary of black and white being imposed onto Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians became black and the Israelis became white, even though there is an entire conversation on whether light-skinned Jews are white or rather simply white passing. So this brings us to the end of this presentation, and it's not a particularly happy note to leave off, but what I want to talk about is the re-normalization of anti-Semitism. For a variety of reasons, anti-Semitism, overt anti-Semitism is no longer taboo. It is acceptable to be openly, overtly anti-Semitic in public society, in polite society. It is acceptable to praise anti-Semites. It's acceptable to denigrate Jewish people. And partly this is connected to the Holocaust. Why might that be? So recently, the Claims Conference, which is an organization that kind of deals with Holocaust education and restitution, did a poll, the first poll to be carried out in all 50 states of America among millennials and Gen Z. So that's people my age bracket in their 30s, right down to their teens. And the results were quite shocking. 10% of people thought that the Jews were responsible for the Holocaust. A surprising number of people had never even heard of the Holocaust. Now, this is connected with the rise in, or rather the resurgence of modern anti-Semitism, the renormalization of anti-Semitism. As the non-Jewish world moves further away from the Holocaust, as the Holocaust becomes to them more a distant memory, they stop feeling guilty, anti-Semitism stops being a taboo. As we said earlier, the Soviets didn't want to be associated with anti-Semitism because it was so closely associated with the Holocaust and the crimes of the Nazis. And that's no longer the case. And people are once again seeing, or we are once again seeing, a resurgence of anti-Semitism. We saw it in Britain with Jeremy Corbyn, in the United States, in France, in many, many, many places. And I'm sure that many of you have your own experiences with it. And it's really important that we have honest conversations about anti-Semitism. So that means having conversations and saying, yes, it is a systemic, institutional form of prejudice. Yes, it is as bad as other forms of prejudice. And we as Jewish people should never be ashamed to say that. We are always shamed by the non-Jewish world. We're made to change our bodies, our faces, our hair, our names, and we must reject this. We must reject this notion that we must change ourselves to be accepted. We must reject this notion that we must be quiet to be accepted. It is vitally important that in 2020, Jewish people are standing up and saying, I am proud to be Jewish, and I am no longer going to allow the non-Jewish world to make me ashamed of that and to target me with anti-Semitism. And that is our job. As I said at the beginning, anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It is a non-Jewish problem. And if the world seeks ever to dismantle the system of oppression, if the world seeks ever to end the disease of anti-Semitism, then it must do work, it must look into itself, and it must have a public reckoning to really understand that it is a deeply embedded form of prejudice that is one of the building blocks of their societies. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for joining me. And I think we can now open up the room for a few questions. Linda, I can stop sharing.
Thank you. Ben, that was amazing. Thank you very, very, very much. An absolute tour de force. I've got a couple of questions for you from participants, and then I'll ask you a couple of my own. Margaret Green says, I wonder if you have a theory about why anti-Semitism is used in both right-wing and progressive movements at particular times.
That's a really excellent question, and it is rooted in this notion of how the non-Jewish world uses us. So historically, anti-Semitism or a hatred of Jews has been used to unite supposed enemies. We saw it during the Reformation when Catholics, a very prominent Dutch Catholic philosopher, said to, or regarding Martin Luther, if you hate the Jews, then we're all Christian. Because it's this idea of us, it's the idea of Jews being used by the non-Jewish world. It has absolutely no bearing in our reality, but it's this concept that as one of the building blocks of kind of Western Christian civilization is used to explain, it's used to unite, and it's also used to denigrate. And this is the contradiction. We see anti-Semitism being used to kind of, or Jews are being used as a political football, but we also see meetings of the far right and the far left and others in between coming together to talk about their hatred of Jews. And it's this notion that we must really kind of accept and start to understand, because it unites the far left and the far right and everyone in between. And it can be the exact same ideology. In Germany right now, we're starting to see far right groups say Israel is our misfortune. Yeah. And that is really a leftist position, whereas historically the Nazis said the Jews are our misfortune.
Okay, Melvin Greenstein says, if there's one message you could give every Jew to improve the anti-Jewish perception, what would it be? And he thanks you for a really informative lecture.
I would say, be proud of being Jewish. We should integrate with the non-Jewish world. We all in this conversation live in the diaspora. I don't think anyone is calling in from Israel. We live in the non-Jewish world. There's one person. We live in the non-Jewish world. We should integrate, but we should do so proudly. We should do so with pride in our identities. And we should demand acceptance. We should say, we're not going to change our names, or our faces, or our noses, or our culture to be accepted. You should accept us because we're people and we deserve the same respect that everyone else has. And I think this notion that, assimilation in some ways has been very dangerous for Jewish people, because we've acquiesced to every demand the non-Jewish world has made of us, and it hasn't changed anything. It's not like it worked, so we have to try something different.
So Ben, Cindy Moritz has asked you the question that actually I was going to ask you. You started off by saying anti-Semitism is a non-Jewish problem. It's not our problem, it's theirs. So she says, are there any examples of non-Jewish initiatives to educate and to create these umbrellas that you speak about? Or is it still Jewish people trying to do that, as we seem to be doing in our work, you, me, and all others like us? Yeah.
I think it is primarily Jewish people, unfortunately. And I think that a lot of Jewish people still don't really understand that it's not actually our problem. And that's not to say that it doesn't impact us. Obviously, it impacts us greatly, but it's not ours. It's not our problem. It's a problem that we have to deal with. There are, of course, amazing non-Jewish allies. There are non-Jewish people who speak out on social media. There are non-Jewish people who speak out publicly on behalf of Jewish people who work for Jewish organizations devoted to anti-Semitism. And there are kind of governmental initiatives put in place to try and support Jewish people, led by the non-Jewish world. But the problem is they don't understand it. Let's look at Germany post-Holocaust. Germany has done potentially, others some may disagree with me on this, but potentially everything a country can do to apologize. They can't go back in time, but the amount of time and effort they have spent on Holocaust education is immense. Has it worked? No, it hasn't. Anti-Semitism is rising, or has risen, let's be honest, in Germany. The Tsar of kind of anti-Semitism in Germany, the person tasked to deal with it, said very publicly, I cannot say that Jews should wear a kippah in Germany. This is 2019, 2020, so we can see that they have not learned. So despite their best efforts, if they don't understand the problem, i.e. being it's a deeply embedded institutional form of anti-Semitism connected to 2,000 plus years of history, then they will fail.
Ben, but there's a real sort of catch-22 here for me. If it's a non-Jewish problem, but they don't think it's a problem, then it's not.
Yeah, you're right. So that's where we come in. So yes, we have a role to play, and our role is to speak openly about our experiences. And that again is where Jewish pride comes in. Not being ashamed, not being quiet, not being silent. We should talk about our experiences. We should dialogue, we should facilitate, but ultimately we're not able to do the deep dive that it requires because, I mean, we don't hate ourselves, basically. So yes, we're part of the process, but ultimately the major work, and this is the language we're using now. You know, when we talked in the summer about the Black Lives Matter movement, people spoke about work, doing the work to kind of look into yourself and to dismantle the system of oppression, whether it's internally or as a kind of wider society. And that same work has to be done to dismantle or defeat anti-Semitism. But of course, we are a part of that process because, yeah, you're right. They don't know it's a problem if we don't talk about it.
Yeah. I think that's it, Ben. I'm not seeing any more questions coming up, but really getting messages from people saying how much they enjoyed it. And I really, really enjoyed it. I kept getting texts from Natasha saying, was I right? Was I right? Yes, Natasha, you were right. I just want to talk about your book quickly before you go. So the book is called Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. And the book is inspired by Ben's experiences with the LGBTQ plus pride movement. And he aims to educate, inspire, and empower Jewish people to reject the shame of anti-Semitism and non-Jewish perceptions of what it means to be a Jew, ultimately enabling them to begin the process of defining Jewish identity through Jewish experience, Jewish history, and Jewish values. So I hope, Ben, that you do really well with this, with your book. I will just actually send out with the recording the name of the book, and you know that people can get it. So sorry, I'm just seeing Lee Boyskind has written something. Lee, I can only see that you've written the word wolf there. Just hang on a sec.
He said, what is your view on the IRA definition? Is it possible that we as Jews are seen to cry wolf?
Okay.
I would say no. I mean, the reality is experts who really understand anti-Semitism put that together. And I think that we're not crying wolf because it's real. What we're doing is just creating a working definition to say, okay, this is what we experience, because we're often, people doubt us so much. So, I mean, listen, I think that if someone is going to accuse the Jews of crying wolf, they're going to accuse us of crying wolf, whatever we do. So I don't think it'll be rooted in the specific IRA definition.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much. I only got half the message on my computer, so I'm glad you picked that up then. Thanks, Lee.
Well, there's another question that says, do I believe that anti-Semitism can be defeated? I can give you a hopeful answer and say yes, of course, but I can also give you an answer rooted in history, and kind of as a historian, that is kind of what I tend to veer towards. And it's not if there's the work, not if the work isn't done. You know, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. We've seen how the non-Jewish world has treated us for 2,000 plus years, and they show no signs of changing. So theoretically, yes, it is possible. In reality, it doesn't seem to be happening.
Can you, so where else, let me see.
So how do Jewish people position themselves in a woke world? So that's really in reference to, can Jewish people be progressive? Can we support other communities? And the answer is, of course we can. We can stand with the Black community, the LGBTQ plus community, partly because Black people, LGBTQ plus people exist in the Jewish community. So if we're to support our own people, we also have to support others, but we do so proudly. So we say we are proud Jews, and we're not going to be quiet about our experiences, and we're going to talk about our experiences, and we're going to state very clearly that our experiences matter just as much as other people's. I think that's how we position ourselves in a kind of woke, progressive world.
I've got a question here in the Q&A that I've just found from Larissa, who says, thank you so much for your presentation. As an educator, and I've often thought about this as well, Ben, how do you feel about the risk of introducing stereotypes through talking about discrimination and stereotyping? Can that be avoided? That's the first question. And the second, how important are non-Gentile safe spaces for empowerment? And how important is it, having experienced anti-Semitism, to educate about it?
So I think regarding education, it's context. So when I talk about it with my students, I explain the historical context. So yes, we're talking about this concept of Jews with big noses, but we're explaining where it came from, how it has been repeated for over 1,000 years, and what it does to Jewish people. So I think it's not just, one little snippet given to them. I think it's really important we always give context. And I think that is really how we kind of avoid spreading anti-Semitism inadvertently. And I guess, are Jewish spaces important? And I think they are. And it's not to say that we have to have Jewish only spaces, but I do think listen, we're a community, we're a people, and we should be communicating with each other about our shared experiences. And sometimes it's nice to do that. I live in Hong Kong, and I don't really have a Jewish community. I've got a couple of Jewish friends, and sometimes it's nice to talk to Jewish people because they get it. And they understand, and they have their own experiences, and I'm not coming from this back foot of having to explain. So I do think having safe spaces for us to share and dialogue about our experiences is really important, and to support each other. It isn't easy to be a Jew in the non-Jewish world. That's just the reality. I know it's not a particularly happy thing to say, but it's just the reality. And there are amazing non-Jewish people who support us, but mostly it's Jewish people who we need to support each other. And how important is it, having experienced anti-Semitism, to talk about it? I think it can help, but I do think as a teacher, I talk about things that I've not experienced. One of my classes I'm teaching right now is representation of women in pop culture. Obviously, I'm not a woman, but I think it's about doing the work. If you aren't Jewish and you're wanting to talk about anti-Semitism, you really have to do the work. You have to speak to Jewish people. You have to, do the real research and understand your place in the fight. It's not about a non-Jewish person speaking over a Jewish person. If a Jewish person is there, then allowing the Jewish person to talk, I think, is really important. And if they're not, then of course we want non-Jewish people to speak about it, but they have to speak about it from a kind of an educated, informed position. Oh, you're muted, Linda.
I know, and I was complimenting you, and you didn't hear anything. That was really just an absolutely amazing way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Thank you so much. I think that everybody who was on this webinar will agree that you tackled the problem from such a different perspective. I mean, we all know, because we teach about pre-Christian Judaism and Christian anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, anti-Semitism in the 18th century. But the way you've managed to layer and layer and layer it and bring it through to what's happening today has been just absolutely remarkable. So thank you very, very, very much, Ben. And I will... really, I'd like you to do some more talks for us. So we'll talk about your other things that you talk about, but this has been just fantastic. And thank you so much for coming. And I'm sure everybody will agree with me that this was marvelous. So again, thank you to Art Jamming for bringing Ben to us. And I wish you a good schloff. You've got early tomorrow morning, so you must go and get some sleep. And everybody's just saying thank you, thank you, thank you, and see
Thank
you
you so
soon.
much.
Be well, keep safe,
too.
and keep doing the good work.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Bye,
Ben.
Mum.
Bye.